We just saw the finale to Squid Game Season 3, but what if I told you it was based on some real-life events? A children's prison, government cover-ups, a man so broke he sold his laptop, and the deadliest children's game the world has ever seen. It might sound like a Hollywood thriller, but this is real. And if you're one of the 142 million people who watch Squid Games, you might not realize that the show's most chilling moments aren't fiction. They're ripped from the shadows of South Korea's hidden past. What if I told you the global phenomenon that had everyone talking about debt, desperation, and death games was actually inspired by a real-life horror camp run by the South Korean government, a place so terrifying it was nicknamed Brothers' Home, where children and homeless people were thrown into a nightmare just for being poor. And what if I told you that if that place had never existed, Squid Games wouldn't either? Stick around, because in the next few minutes, you're going to see how a brutal piece of history, a decade of rejection, and a filmmaker on the edge of giving up accidentally created the biggest Netflix show of all time. South Korea, 1980s. The country is rebuilding, fast. It's gone from the war-torn poverty to an economic boom. But with success comes a public image to protect, especially with the 1988 Seoul Olympics just around the corner. South Korea wants to show the world that it's modern, clean, and powerful. There's just one problem: the streets. Poverty is everywhere. Homeless people, orphans, disabled children. It doesn't look good for international press. So, the government makes a decision: clear the streets. Police begin rounding people up. Not criminals, just anyone who looks poor. If you didn't have ID, were dressed badly, or were just in the wrong place, you could be taken and sent to Brothers' Home. At the center of it all was a man named Park In-kyun, a former army general turned warden who ruled Brothers' Home with military brutality. He reported to be running a Christian charity, but inside, he operated what survivors described as a real-life hell. Some were just children when they were taken. Others were homeless, disabled, or simply without ID. Over 30,000 people passed through its gates. And the worst part, Brothers' Home wasn't an isolated case. It was one of at least 36 similar facilities scattered across South Korea at the time, part of a nationwide social cleansing campaign. People imprisoned there were forced into slave labor. They manufactured textiles, soap, and toys, many of which were sold to major Korean companies like Daesung and Hwashin. Survivors say the conditions were worse than prison. Those who resisted were beaten or killed. Some survivors estimate hundreds may have died inside. One man, Shin Sang-rok, who was imprisoned as a teenager, testified that he witnessed children tortured with electric shocks and physically violated by guards. "They treated us like garbage," he recalled in an interview years later. The government denied everything. Records were destroyed. For decades, Brothers' Home was buried in silence, until someone dared to look closer. Officially, it was a welfare center, a rehabilitation facility, but the truth? It was a concentration camp. From the outside, it looked like a Christian shelter. Inside, thousands of people, many of them children, were locked up, beaten, tortured, and forced into slave labor. They made products for big companies. They were starved, and if they tried to escape, they were killed. Over 30,000 people were held there. The Korean government denied everything. Survivors were too afraid to speak. For decades, it was erased from history until one man started asking questions. Fast forward to the early 2000s. A struggling filmmaker named Hwang Dong-hyuk is drowning in debt. He lives with his elderly mother and grandmother. He can't pay his bills, he's depressed, he's hungry, and he has a script. It's strange, violent, uncomfortable. It's about desperate people playing deadly childhood games for money. But beneath the surface, it's not just fiction. Hwang is channeling everything. The inequality he's seen, the brutality buried in South Korea's past, and the real-life accounts of Brothers' Home he's been reading. No one knows this yet, but Squid Games is being born. Hwang starts pitching the script. First as a film, everyone rejects it. For over 10 years, he gets the same answers. It's too unrealistic, too violent. Nobody wants to see poor people die on screen. But Hwang refuses to give up. He pawns his laptop to keep going. He keeps rewriting. He keeps pushing, until finally, someone listens. In 2019, Netflix is expanding into South Korea. They're hungry for unique content, something bold, something different. They find Hwang's script. It's weird, risky, but they say yes. They give him a budget, a team, a chance. The show was originally called Round 6, and Netflix's approval came at a time when no Korean show had ever topped the platform globally. Even with a relatively modest $21 million budget, many inside Netflix weren't sure it would work. But Hwang believed in it. He'd lived it. And with Netflix's global reach, the The forgotten past he buried in his story was about to hit center stage. And in 2021, after over a decade of struggle, Squid Games is released. Nobody, not even Netflix, is prepared for what happens next. The show explodes. And here's where things get weird. Did you know the shapes on the guards' masks, the circle, triangle, and square, weren't random? They're inspired by letters in the Korean alphabet, and each one represents a different role in the show's hierarchy. The creepy doll from Red Light, Green Light, her name is Young Hee, based on a character used in Korean elementary school textbooks. Even the big twist, the identity of player 001, wasn't originally going to be revealed until season 2. There's more symbolism hiding in plain sight, and the deeper you look, the darker it gets. Within weeks, Squid Games becomes the most watched Netflix series in history, 142 million households, 1.6 billion hours viewed, #1 in 94 countries. TikTok is flooded with fans recreating the games. Halloween costumes sell out. Even real-life competitions are launched, minus the murder. But while the world is watching the games, very few realize what they're really seeing. Because the truth is, Squid Games is a ghost story. A story haunted by the screams of brothers home, the masked guards, the faceless VIPs, the dehumanization, the silent terror of being punished for being poor. It's not just creative fiction, and it's historical memory. Most people thought Squid Games was extreme, but here's the twist. The real story was worse. Survivors of Brothers Home have spoken out in recent years. One man said he was just 14 when he was taken off the street and locked away. He watched others die. He was beaten so badly he still has scars. Others were tortured with electric shocks, forced into unpaid labor. One survivor described it as a place where poor people were treated like trash. When Squid Games dropped, some survivors said it finally felt like someone had told their story, even if it was dressed as fiction. And Hwang has admitted this is personal. He grew up in poverty. He lived the class divide. He saw how society turns a blind eye to those who struggle. He didn't just create Squid Games to shock the world. He created it to remember the forgotten. And the twist is, it worked. Because after the show aired, Brothers Home was back in the headlines. People started asking questions again, investigations reopened, survivors began telling their stories. The fiction woke the world up to a truth it had ignored for decades. In 2018, the South Korean government launched a new Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate the atrocities at Brothers Home. Survivors gave testimony. Evidence was uncovered. But even now, very few officials have been held accountable. There have been proposals to turn the old Brothers Home site into a memorial. Some call it necessary, others say it's reopening wounds. But one thing is clear, for the victims, acknowledgement matters. They lived through horror, and through Squid Games, some finally felt seen. So how did Squid Games come to be? It wasn't just one event, it was a chain reaction, a butterfly effect of horror, hope, and persistence. If it wasn't for the Korean government's attempt to hide poverty, there would have been no Brothers Home. No hidden horror for Hwang to uncover. If it wasn't for Hwang Dong-hyuk's crushing debt and refusal to give up, the script would have stayed buried, collecting dust. If it wasn't for Netflix's search for something risky and bold at the exact right time, the world would have never seen it. If it wasn't for Brothers Home, if it wasn't for a decade of rejection, if it wasn't for a struggling writer who sold his laptop just to survive, then Squid Games, the most watched show in Netflix history, wouldn't exist. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future videos in our Butterfly Effect series. Want more? Click here to watch how Marvel Comics was born from a missed flight, and click here to discover the mob deal and teenage dreams that created DC Comics. And remember, if not for this, this wouldn't exist.